focus on age-related depression, what it looks like, what it is, and what we can do about it, in the hopes that we can find a way to alleviate that depression. And of course, some big questions like, why do older people have depression? So starting out with what is depression, it's a mental health condition. Now, mental health still has kind of a black eye. Very often families who have someone who's mentally ill will hide it because it's not socially acceptable. And 100 years ago, if you had cancer, that was not socially acceptable either. My goodness, I got my phone. Well, I had turned it off. I don't know quite how that worked. Let me try again to turn it off. I had left it in the other room just because of that. I'm going to just put it in here so if it goes off. You know, sometimes when you turn your phone off, they can still turn it on. Have you ever seen that? I was doing a wedding, and I turned the phone off. And right in the middle of the wedding, some spam is coming through on my phone. So mental health has not been well received, and we don't talk about it very much, and yet mental health is a very common condition. I don't know what the statistics are, but I know that it's very, very common and oh so important. It is just as important as our physical health. And you can have a mental health illness that is absolutely debilitating. Now, those illnesses are called MDDs. That stands for Major Depressive Disorder, and that's clinical depression. Mostly, that is a long-term, sometimes lifelong, a long-term condition, and that's very different than age-related depression. Clinical depression is persistent. Age-related depression is transitory. And why do people have, or how do they get clinical depression? Well, there are several reasons. One is sometimes it's family-oriented, where it runs in the family, and it happens. Other people have taken drugs, or maybe gone through some horrible experience which literally unbalanced them. When I was working for the Visiting Nurse Association hospice as a hospice chaplain while still pastoring a church, my desk was right next to Greg's desk, and Greg was a social worker. So he was trained in psychology. And 25 years before, Greg had the unfortunate experience of being drafted into the Army and ended up in the infantry in Vietnam. He was not cut out to be a warrior. The things that he saw were so difficult that as a young man, he had a complete mental breakdown. And when I knew him, he was still struggling with it. And then one day he didn't come to work. And so our manager went to his house and he had shot himself because he got so depressed. He couldn't get over the depression that came because of what he saw. So that can happen. But supposedly 5.7% of senior citizens suffer from clinical depression. So that's not a real big thing, 1 in 20. But I have a hunch that the senior citizens who suffer from age-related depression is much, much higher. I would guess that it's at least half. That at least half of us, at one point or another in our life, in our aged life after 65. I said to my wife the other day, to be 65 again. Well, after 65, age-related depression just seems to come with the territory. It's so easy to get depressed. So we don't really know how many senior citizens suffer from age-related depression. But as a pastor, having counseled parishioners all of my life, I can assure you that there are many, many people who have this problem. And in fact, next session in 2 weeks, we'll be talking about volunteering. And one of the big, big problems in getting somebody to start to volunteer is for them to get over their shadowy depression that hangs there sometimes and get them out where they can be rewarded greatly by their volunteer work. Just growing old can cause depression, bereavement. Who's old and is not acquainted with bereavement? I mean, what do? We come home from the funeral of a dear friend, and then next month another dear friend. Yes, it gets depressing. We lose our spouse, our life partner, our lover. We've been with that person all of our lives, and suddenly he or she is no more. There's reason to get depressed. That's not something that you can just shrug off. You're not going to get over it by next week. You won't even be over it next month or next year. It's going to take a while. But there are some things that we can do to help. We get depression because of the loss of kingdom. And we've gone over that. The idea that this affects males probably more than females. But the idea that, I used to be in charge of this or that, or I worked at this profession or that, it's all taken away. When you retire, I go to Kaiser for my physical care. I went yesterday to see a doctor. It was a lady. My goodness, young, pretty, never guessed she was a doctor. I'll bet you she has never given a thought to the fact that she has it in her contract that when she's 65, she has to retire whether she wants to or not. Boy, is that hard to take. I mean, these doctors need counseling because they don't want to quit, and they're literally kicked out by Kaiser. Kaiser won't have them. Oh, yes, they can come and work per diem, but they don't have a choice of schedule. They're given what's left over. It's not a very satisfying thing. After years of being on the top of the heap, it's hard to take. So loss of kingdom is a big issue for both men and women, but particularly for men. And I also think, in my own experience, and I've read it in books, that men are not equipped to grieve as well as women are. Women just do it better. And if you don't grieve your losses, and let's face it, folks, growing old is all about losses, all the way down the line, the loss of physical ability, the loss of mental acuity, the loss of your job, the loss of just friends, co-workers, friends, they die. Oh, it's all about losses, and men just don't do as well. And what happens if you don't grieve, go through the bereavement process? Well, very often if somebody's crying, a friend will say, "Oh, don't cry, Mary. Don't cry, Mary. He's in a better place." Well, that's not a helpful thing to say. Mary actually needs to cry because that's part of bereavement. She needs to express that sorrow. We need to be able to get it out. We had a hospice patient who lost his sister. They lived together. Neither one ever married. I tell you, when she died, the man refused to grieve. And then one day, 2 months later, another sister brought her brother into our hospice office. He was a complete mental case. He completely collapsed. And we had to call mental health and sent him down there by ambulance because he was literally out of his mind from not processing grief. So that's what we need to do. Diminishing physical ability, how depressing is that? I mean, when I was young, I could do anything. I mean, I was a rock climber on the walls of Yosemite Valley. I could hike for 25 miles with my backpack on. I could do anything that I wanted to do physically. And now, when I drive to the post office, that first 50 feet is tough walking. I have to kind of get my gait back. My arthritis kicks in. I'm stiff, not smooth. I walk like an old man because I am an old man. So if I can accept myself as being an old man and accept the fact that I have physical limitations that are growing daily, I mean, look at my swimming times. Now at 83, I am swimming twice as slow as when I was 72 and started. In just 11 years, my times have doubled. Is that not depressing? Many swimmers quit. They can't take it. So what do? You focus on something else. Don't focus on the time. I don't even get my time when I come in. I focus on trying to do it better. I focus on technique. I focus on my breathing. So you have to work at it. And then, of course, there are the negative circumstances that are called life. Because here's what happens in life. You have financial problems. You have family stress. So-and-so doesn't get along with so-and-so. You have regrets of things that you wish you had done, but you didn't do them, and now it's too late. Or you might have stress from moving. Moving is very disruptive, and it causes stress. And it can certainly put a person in a depression, especially an older person who leaves their home of many years and moves into a retirement home. That has to be as high on the stress level as anything is. And then there are legal problems that you might have for whatever reason. And I added giving birth, although that's not something that the old people do, but it's interesting that for young people, that is an issue. Very often, the postpartum blues, the fact that the mother was carrying the child, and then when the child's delivered, there is a psychological impact from that. Now, when I was in Atlanta getting my radiation treatments, they had lots of classes for us so that we were prepared for what was going on. And they warned us that post-radiation, probably a month after the radiation stopped, more than 70% of us would have depression. And boy, did I have depression. And I've never been a depressive person. I mean, I get up in the morning cheerily and ready to go. But in those mornings, I didn't want to get out of bed. It was all black. So we were prepared for that. So I had medicine already in the medicine cabinet to take for my depression, and the medicine helped. And I got through the next 3 months, and it was over. But I experienced it myself. And I never had experienced depression like that. And that was really true clinical depression. But in a sense, it's age-related. If you're old, and radiation depression does not stay with you. It does leave you. And of course, alcohol and drugs, misuse, can certainly cause depression. I'll be having time here for you to talk in a bit. Well, it's scary to grow old. My mother, who in her 80s, who is my model because everything that happens to her happened to me, it seems, my mother always said, it takes a lot of courage to grow old. She figured it out, and she wasn't, she didn't have all the counseling courses that I had at Fuller. We fear having some terrible illness because we see people around us, our age, who have terrible illnesses. I mean, I got COVID again the end of February, and there was a lady who lives in Yucaipa, just 4 years older than me, who I knew, and she got COVID a week later, and she died. So we fear those things. We fear our money will run out. We fear to look in the mirror and see what we look like. Oh, I don't like those wrinkles. It looks like our clothes. If you stood there in the nude and looked at yourself, it looked like your clothes need ironing, but you realize it's your skin. We fear the continued loss of our physical abilities. I mean, will I end up in a wheelchair? None of us want that. We fear the loss of our mental powers because we know people who got dementia. And above all, we fear the process of dying, which looms in our future sooner rather than later. Well, that brings us then, we're at the most depressing part of this presentation, suicide. I want to discuss suicide for a minute because I saw it firsthand several times. A lot of older people don't realize the magnitude of suicide and what it does to family dynamics. Suicide solves their personal problem immediately, but it creates untold problems for the family for generations. Suicide is a form of murder. It's self-murder. It's murdering yourself. You could go to jail for that. But of course, you're dead. It breaks the 10 Commandments. And I can even tell you from my reading of the Bible that suicide is never God's will for you. Thielicke, a famous German theologian, called it man's greatest temptation. And oh, how true that is. Oh my, how easy it is to start thinking about that. Life is sacred and holy. We have no right to end it. And suicide diminishes everyone's humanity because it says no to life. When I heard about a college student who I didn't know, who stood in front of the train and let it run him down and kill him, I really felt bad. Because it diminished who I am in a way. Because I desperately want to say yes to life and let the wonders of life go before me. I don't want to say no to life. And I don't want to see anyone else say no to life either. And then there's this number that you might not know about. You've heard of 911. Well, this is 988. If you dial 988, you'll be connected to the suicide hotline. So that's a good number to know. Maybe not for yourself, but maybe for a friend. 988. So let's talk then about taking positive steps toward wholeness, because that's what we're talking about in the encompassing thing in our whole, there's no word for it, agedom, our whole dome of being old is trying to be a whole person. That's what we want to be. We don't want to be just a little shell of a person who used to go out and have fun and now stays home. We don't want to be the person who sits home lonely and has no friends when we used to have friends. We want to be a whole person, no matter what our age. So let's look at what you can do and not what you can't do. That's reframing the negative. So if push comes to shove and you end up in a wheelchair and you're in a care home, you've got to focus on bingo, because it's fun. They have certain activities like that you can do in a wheelchair, and you have to be willing to take part in it because you're trying to be a whole person. You have to look at what you have and not what you don't have. And so, I counseled this lady in a wheelchair, and she was so upset. And so then we started talking about her children, and she just relaxed, and a smile came on her face. And though they live far away, that was a healing thing for her mind to talk about her children. Appreciate your relationships. Don't pine for the ones that are lost. So for the widow, and remember now, out of 10 marriages, in 9 of those marriages, the man will die first. So the widow pines for her husband. But what would he want for her? If he could speak from the grave, what would he want for her? He would want her to be happy. And we have to bring that thought to any old person that we talk with who's suffering from depression or having problems. The fact that he would want her to be happy. But it takes an effort, and if we make the effort, we can connect with people. Well, we have to worry about isolation. How easy it is to be isolated, particularly when you end up living at home alone, which happens to a number of people. Then you have to assess, is that still the best place for you? And if it is, what steps can we take to keep you from being alone, even though you live alone? And the answer, of course, is to get involved in organizations, with people, whatever it takes, churches. at my church, we had an old couple. He was 79 and she was 77. And they came from Maine, and they moved out 29 Palms to be in the sun. And they had no friends, but they came to our church right off, first Sunday they were there. And they became an integral part of our church, and we came to know and love them. And then 14 months after they came to our church, she came down with a cancer and died. And I'll tell you, the fact that he was connected with our church made all the difference in the world, because we had volunteers to help in the home. We gave him support. I made pastoral visits. And he later said that he doesn't know what they would have done if he hadn't made that connection to our church. So you've got to connect with people. And it doesn't have to be a church, folks. I mean, it could be a club or some organization that you get into that's got a lot of volunteers. And you could volunteer at Redlands Community Hospital, and it's a tight-knit group. But at church, of course, I live church, so that comes to mind. Now, today you can use technology to overcome hurdles that could keep you from connecting. What are the hurdles? Well, the biggest and most common hurdle to connecting is hard of hearing. That's a struggle. Because if you're hard of hearing, or not even deaf, I notice I'm losing my hearing, but it's very slow. It separates you, it cuts you off, you can't communicate. So you just have to use technology. You have to get some kind of hearing aid that'll work for you. And not all hearing aids work for every person. Because my wife tried them, bought a set, and finally gave up, and they're in the drawer. And I just shout at her now. And that seems to work, except when we're in the middle of the night in the airport lounge at the airport in Denver, sitting there all night, and I'm shouting at her. But that's what you expect with old people. They're going to shout at each other, so what? When you think of the problems you could have, other disabilities would be if you don't speak well. Like, let's say that maybe you had a surgery on your voice, and so your voice is very weak. Well, then you need to talk into a microphone. You need to have some kind of little amplifier systems. And with Bluetooth today, you can find something that you could use so people could hear you. And of course, then we have mobility problems, and we have to work around that. But even with dial-a-ride now, you can get a lift in a wheelchair. So you don't have to drive. My wife this month gave up her driver's license. Boy, that's a big deal. Imagine giving up your driver's license after you've driven all your life. Imagine the impact on your mind to think, I am so old that now I can't even drive. She voluntarily gave it up. She realized that she shouldn't be driving, but she now is not a safe driver. And so I was fine. I told her I'd support her, whatever she decided to do. And so she gave it up. So we work around our disabilities. If she was living alone, she'd be taking dial-a-ride places. There's always something that you can do to make the world a better place, and that will lift depression. If you help someone else with something, that's the best medicine that ever invented for depression. It makes you feel good. You know you made a difference. And in 2 weeks from now, we're going to be going over in detail opportunities and hearing actual people stand up and talk about their experiences volunteering to try to motivate us to get involved in the community. So we'll discover that next time, but I would point out the last thing, seek out opportunities for intergenerational contact. Boy, that's a big phrase. That just means see if you can find a way to be with young people. One way is to help a church here with like VBS. I mean, maybe you can put the crayons out, or, you don't have to be like a brilliant teacher with coming up with a lesson, but there are things you can do. They need people to just be there. And being around children. You know what? I go to several different kinds of swim meets. Some are USMS, that's United States Masters Swimming, and they're mostly local. They're held all over, and they're all people who are 50 or older. Then I go to state championships, and their state games. Those are from age 5 and up. And I tell you, I just love going to the state games. I just love swimming with the kids. Last weekend, I swam in the Missouri State Championships, and I was up there on the blocks with a 6-year-old on my left and a 17-year-old on my right. And I mean, it's just so invigorating for me to be around young people and participating with them in these games that we play called swimming, that for a few hours, I can forget that I'm an old man. And that doesn't happen very often. I mean, does that happen when you come to church? No. You're still dealing with your aches and pains, but boy, I tell you, this idea of intergenerational contact, you just need to seek it out, because it's never going to happen to you folks unless you seek it out. Because you're going to be at home and the kids will be somewhere else. Oh my. And I'll tell you, next 2 weeks, I'll tell you about a program I started in math tutoring for retired folks. It was a wild success. It was really good. All right, now, this is your opportunity to talk about depression or any of the topics that I've raised so far today or last week or the week before. And sometimes people give me comments privately. They don't want to stand up. So one person said she didn't want to stand up, but she wanted to say that a friend of hers fights off depression by journaling, writing in a journal, writing a diary. And that's not for everybody, but for her it works. Great idea. Okay, I've got microphones. Thank you.
And I'll pass this over for you.
Yeah. I got a phone call. Remember when telephones first came out and we had portable phones, how amazing that was? That was like the latest technology. So I'm working outside, and my wife brings me the portable phone. We just got it about a month before. And I got a telephone call. And so I'm talking to the guy, but he was very faint. I could hardly hear him. And he said he could hardly hear me. And when the call was over, I looked, and I'd been talking into the speaker, and my microphone was at my ear. What a genius. All right. If you would like to say something, contribute, anything you want to share.
I've been a constant complainer about hearing our pastor preach. The decibel level was high enough, the sound level was high enough, but I could not understand him. So,
Did you understand me?
yes, I understand you. Because I went to my neurologist after I had fallen. I had a situation in my head. I started out from the bottom and had him check and make sure it wasn't causing a problem with my hearing. I went to my general practitioner, my primary care doctor, to check my ears to see if they were okay as far as physically okay. Then I went to my hearing aid person and to make sure that my hearing aids were working right. And he checked them out and found that I was not hearing the higher level of speaking. And he corrected that with a few little hitches. And so this morning I could understand a little bit better, and I can always understand you, Craig. Your speech habits are
They're different. Each person is different.
And speech habits, like in younger people, they have to talk so fast that you can't seem to catch up because our hearing is older than we are and they are.
Yeah.
And sometimes they go so fast you can't understand them.
Yeah. But let me tell you, the pastoral staff and the leadership of this church is very aware of the sound limitations of our current system. And we are actively planning to replace this with a brand new sound system that will be much more effective, and we are going to spend a lot of money to get it. So it's going to be the very best because, you know, like it says in the Bible, how shall they hear without a PA system? Anything else? Oh, yeah.
First. What are the symptoms of depression? In other words, how do you know if you got it?
Okay, I'll start with clinical depression. It's much worse than age-related depression. Clinical depression, everything's literally black. There is no joy in your life. And you wake up in the morning, you don't even want to get out of bed because there's nothing to get out of bed for. There's nothing worth living for. That's the very bottom of depression. Now, there are other stages that are not quite as severe. You could have depression where you just are joyless. And the key thing is that the things that used to bring you enjoyment, you don't want to do anymore. The things that you used to like, you don't like anymore. The things that used to be fun to do, you don't want to do them anymore. That's depression. That's all it is. It's simple depression. Depression is when you withdraw into your shell, when you don't want to talk to anyone, or particularly strangers. That's depression. Depression is when you just stay home. You don't even want to go to the market. You just want to stay in your recliner. That's why, I just bought a new recliner the other day because I tell you, I love recliners. My wife, retired hospice nurse, I told her that I'm renaming it. It's my decliner. I can sit in my decliner and decline, but I'm not depressed about it. It's all in good humor. When you find humor, there's no depression. That's the opposite. What's the opposite of depression? It's humor. Think about it. I never encouraged the people in my church to laugh. They just did it naturally. Because that's just part of life. In church, you should be able to laugh just like anything else. Another comment. Good question. Thank you. Oh, yeah, like we did today. We laughed. And that's an important part of a sermon, is to allow people to see a little levity, a little humor, that we could be lighthearted enough to laugh in the midst of discussing some very, very difficult things. And life is difficult. Yes?
How do you know if you have a neighbor or a family member or a friend who you know is depressed, whether you are enabling them or whether you are supporting them?
Well, that's really a good question, isn't it? I guess you would just have to try to evaluate the wholesomeness of your relationship. If you're going and buying the alcohol for the man and bringing that to him, that would clearly be an enabling thing. But if you're going to visit him so that in his sober moments you can have a conversation, then that's not enabling him. But I don't know. I think it just depends on each individual case. You just have to think about how wholesome is this? That's an excellent question. And that's a balance that we all struggle with, like with our spouses. Do I enable her to keep gaining weight? But then I don't want to just nag all the time. So we do creative things. We try to eat low calorie. Still eat. But instead of having a 630 calorie meal, we have a 250 calorie meal. So you just work around those things. But that's a struggle, and it's a balance, and we have to keep asking ourselves the same question over and over again with every situation. Am I enabling, or am I really helping? But thank you for raising that. Yes.
I know so many widows, widowers who will not go out and eat by themselves or participate in clubs without a mate. And I think that's calling depression in on yourself.
It is.
Because if you're out among a crowd of people, doesn't mean you have to interact with them, but just smiling and acknowledging the fact that there are other people around, and who knows, you might run into a friend.
I am next month going to propose to the deacons that we start a visitor program where we target older people who are, say, over 65, particularly those living alone, and we visit them. And I'm going to have a training session to train them to do that. I think a regular program like that goes a long way to alleviate some of the problems we have. Because, you know, we come to church, we're older. Some people say we're useless, and we've heard that. We come to church and we sit here in church and we listen, and then the only contact we ever have with our minister is when we shake his hand at the door. And so contact with a deacon, reading a psalm, having a prayer, that's good. That helps us connect to church. That's one of the great things about church. Even though, you know, we could be a church of all 90-year-olds, we can connect. And that's the blessing. It's not about how much money you put in the offering plate. You won't be remembered for that. But you will be remembered for the relationships you had, the friendships that you developed. People will miss you. As a pastor, I've conducted funerals for years and years and years. And I can tell you what the person was like, even though I never met them even, by who's attending this service. When I have a service and it's just mobbed and overflowing and people out in the street and we're setting up chairs, I know that person really lived a life. And then when I see a funeral, and there's 10 people there, and you wonder, you know, how isolated was that person, or what was that person's life like? So we are what we are, and we make life to be what we want it to be. And what we need to do is we need guidance as we get older to be sure we're connected. And not just leave it to chance, not leave it to us, because that's not a good thing. We need the push from friends to come to church. Church is always good. Always good. And the nice thing now, like my wife is at home, she's watching, she watched the service on YouTube. So you can do that. But that you're still connected because you know those people and you know that pastor, and that's good. Other things you'd like to mention? Well, it wasn't too depressing, was it? No. Oh, good. Because it's something we need to talk about. And if we bring it out and uncover it, we can deal with it. If we hide it, won't admit it, then it festers like a sore. So next time is volunteering. And if you volunteer somewhere, please let me know. I would like you to give a 1-minute presentation on where you volunteer and what it's meant to you. Those are the two things I need to know. Is where do you volunteer and what has it meant to you? Okay, let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this group who came out on this beautiful day to share and talk about growing old. And Lord, as we grow old, my prayer is we all will grow closer